Fighter Command, England, 1940. History likes to remember this war in silhouettes. A Spitfire's wing, curved like a signature. A mosquito slipping through cloud, like it was carved from a single piece of wood. But that's not the shape we're chasing tonight. Picture something else entirely. A thick-nosed slab of black metal, wider than a barn door, screaming 6 feet off the wavetops, with 4 cannons already glowing hot. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why the Royal Air Force needed a thug more than it needed a knight, and why that thug turned out to be one of the deadliest things Britain ever built. Its wings measure just over 495 square feet. Empty. Before a single bullet or drop of fuel goes in, it weighs 15,592 pounds. Loaded for war, that number climbs to 25,400. Remember those figures! We'll come back to them. One of its own pilots put it best. 2 engines, chasing a fuselage that never quite caught up.
Aerodynamics, as a concept, seems to have been optional at the Bristol Aeroplane Company.
This aircraft is the Bristol Beaufighter, and it is, without apology, the ugliest, most brutally effective fighter Britain ever sent to war. Not built to be admired, built to end things quickly. 1938, the Munich crisis. The Air Ministry looks at its own fighter force and realizes it has nothing that can fly far, hit hard, and hunt at night in a war everyone can already feel coming. Bristol's chief engineer, Leslie Fries, doesn't propose a new aircraft. There isn't time for a new aircraft. He proposes a shortcut. Take the wings off a Beaufort bomber already in production. Take its tail. Take its landing gear. Bolt all of it onto a narrower fuselage and drop in 2 engines almost twice the size of anything the Beaufort ever carried. That's the whole plan. No wind tunnel model built from scratch. No years of testing a clean sheet airframe. Just a bomber's skeleton, wearing a fighter's engines. 2,100 drawings! That's all it took to turn one aircraft into another. The first prototype, serial number R2052, flew on July 17, 1939. 8 months, from sketch to sky. 2 weeks before that first flight, the Air Ministry signed a contract for 300 aircraft they had never once seen fly. That's not confidence. That's desperation wearing a suit. The heart of this improvised airframe came from a different kind of genius. Engineer Roy Fedden threw out the conventional poppet valve entirely and replaced it with something almost nobody else was building at scale. The sleeve valve. No valve heads glowing red in the airflow, no mechanical clatter, just a smooth, rotating sleeve inside each cylinder, letting the engine breathe cleaner and run higher compression, even on low-grade fuel that would have caused a normal engine to knock itself apart. On paper, brilliant. In the factory, a nightmare. Tolerances so tight, the first sleeves were finished nearly by hand, one at a time, by machinists working to fractions of a thousandth of an inch. It took years, thousands of engineers and suppliers, and a breakthrough in centrifugal casting before Fedden's sleeves came out round enough, consistent enough to build at wartime speed. The result? An engine that started at 1,150 horsepower and grew past 1,700 before the war was over. And one quiet side effect nobody advertised. Without the clatter of poppet valves, this aircraft's engines were unusually quiet in a dive. That silence would get people killed. On both sides. Here's where the story should turn into a fairy tale about brilliant engineering. It doesn't. The most dangerous enemy this aircraft ever faced wasn't in the sky. It was in a boardroom. Bristol's board was run by the White family. 2 brothers, 2 cousins. Not one of them was an engineer. And they looked at Roy Fedden, a man who had personally designed more than half the horsepower flying for the RAF, with something closer to suspicion than gratitude. In 1942, months after the king knighted him for exactly that work, the board made its move.
They stripped his authority over the design and research staff he'd built from nothing and handed it to a production director instead. When Fedden refused the arrangement, they didn't demote him.
They fired him! On the spot! In the House of Lords, Lord Brabazon stood up and said it plainly. An ordinary mechanic can't be sacked without an inquiry. But apparently, a chief engineer, knighted by the king only months earlier, can be dismissed in an afternoon, with no hearing and no explanation owed to anyone. Bristol never fully recovered its place at the top of British engine design. Not because the Luftwaffe beat them.
Because their own boardroom did.
Now remember those wings. 495 square feet, thick as barn doors. That mass mattered, because Bristol didn't build this aircraft to run. They built it to punch. 4 20mm Hispano cannons under the nose. 6 Browning machine guns buried in the wings. No other fighter of its era carried that much forward-firing weight of metal. Together, they could put 780 pounds of ammunition into a target in exactly 60 seconds. Enough to turn a bomber's fuselage into scrap before the pilot even finished the pass. But firepower like that has a price. Physics doesn't forgive. Every time the pilot pulled the trigger, the recoil from that many guns firing at once acted like an air brake, dropping the aircraft's speed by roughly 25 knots, instantly, mid-attack. It was, quite literally, a fighter that shot itself in the foot to shoot down everything else. Then someone in the Air Ministry had an idea that seemed almost too obvious to be dangerous. Hercules engines were being rationed for the Sterling bomber program, so a batch of these aircraft went out instead with a pair of Rolls-Royce Merlins, the same engine that made the Spitfire a legend, and the Hurricane, and the Lancaster. If Merlin power could win the Battle of Britain, surely it could only make this aircraft better. Merlins on a Spitfire. Legendary. Merlins on an 11.5-ton airframe never designed for them. A different story entirely. The Torque swung the nose hard left on takeoff, hard enough that pilots learned to fight the rudder pedal before the tail even came up. And if one engine failed and its propeller wasn't feathered within seconds, the aircraft simply couldn't hold altitude on the other engine alone. Full stop. 337 Merlin-powered aircraft were built.
102 of them were destroyed in accidents. Not in combat. In accidents.
Almost a third of the fleet, gone before its crews ever saw an enemy aircraft. And if the aircraft was hit, or that engine failure happened at the wrong moment, there was one way out. Not a canopy you could pop and roll from, like a single-engine fighter. A hatch, in the floor, behind the pilot's seat. To reach it, a pilot first had to release the hatch below by remote control, then collapse his own seatback and armrest out of the way, because there was no room to climb past them otherwise. Then reach up, grip 2 parallel steel bars overhead, and haul his entire body, parachute and all, backward through the air, until he was hanging directly over the hole. Then let go, and hope the tail wheel had already swept past before he cleared the fuselage. Now imagine doing that while the aircraft is burning, while it's already falling, while G-forces are pinning you flat against the seat you're supposed to be climbing out of, and your navigator behind you is trying to do the exact same routine through a second, separate hatch of his own. There's a story from the Pacific, a pilot knocked unconscious, and a navigator who couldn't reach the controls to save the aircraft.
He had a choice. Leave his pilot, or stay. He chose to stay.
He wrapped his arms around the man beside him, waved to the rest of the formation, and went down with him into the sea. Every design choice on this aircraft was a trade, and the next one turned that same brutishness into something almost supernatural. This aircraft was never built to dogfight. Out of at least 975 confirmed aerial victories, fewer than 2% were single-engine fighters. It didn't chase what could outturn it. It hunted what couldn't hide. Early airborne radar sets were enormous. Crates of valves and wiring, too big and too heavy to fit inside a Spitfire's slim nose or a Hurricane's narrow cowling. But this aircraft's blunt, roomy nose, the same nose pilots mocked for looking like a barn door, swallowed the new AI Mark IV and Mark VIII sets whole, with room to spare. And remember those unusually quiet engines. In the dark, over a sleeping bomber crew, that silence meant the first warning they ever got was cannon fire. 58% of its bomber kills were the backbone of the German bomber force. Junkers 88s and Heinkel 111s, night after night, over the Mediterranean and the North Sea. But its most absurd trophy was bigger than that. The Blom und Voss BV 222 Viking, a 6-engine flying boat weighing nearly 50 tons, with a wingspan of 148 feet, built to haul strategic cargo across water no other aircraft could reach. Germany built only 12 of them, ever. This aircraft shot down 2, 1 out of every 6 ever to fly, sending dozens of crew and passengers to the bottom of the Mediterranean in aircraft that were never meant to be caught by anything. Daytime fighter pilots have a well-known disease: overclaiming. 5 men shoot at 1 bomber, and 5 men go home certain they got the kill, because the sky was full of tracer and nobody could say for sure whose bullets did the work. Crews flying this aircraft had the opposite problem. They hunted alone, in total darkness, against single bombers that simply vanished the moment they stopped burning. No fireball, no confirmation, no wingman to back up the claim. So most pilots simply didn't claim what they couldn't prove. On the night of April 29th, 1943, Flight Sergeant Alwyn Downing and Navigator John Lyon were flying a lone patrol over the Mediterranean when they stumbled onto a formation of Junkers 52s, transports loaded with troops and cargo. In exactly 10 minutes, Downing made 6 firing passes, one after another, weaving back through the scattering formation each time. When he landed, he modestly claimed 5 destroyed, becoming the only ace-in-a-day pilot this aircraft ever produced. German records, recovered after the war, tell a different number. No other Allied fighter was operating in that area that night. The Luftwaffe didn't log 5 losses. They logged 8. One of the downed aircraft was carrying 16 ground crew. Downing killed more men than he ever claimed, and the official record of 975 kills was never the whole truth. By late 1942, a faster, wooden, altogether more elegant aircraft, the de Havilland Mosquito, was taking over the night fighter role. A bouncer who's lost his door doesn't retire. He finds a rougher bar. Coastal Command handed this aircraft a torpedo and called it the Torbo, handed it rockets and called it the Rockbow. Strike wings like Northcotes ran Wolfpack tactics. A first wave of cannon fire to silence the flak gunners, then a second wave coming in at wave height to release torpedoes almost close enough to touch the hull. It was slow, it was low, and it was terrifying to fly. A straight, level run into a wall of anti-aircraft fire, with no room to jink. The tally from Northcotes alone: over 150,000 tons of shipping sunk, 117 warships destroyed. The price for that tally: 120 of these aircraft torn apart, 241 aircrew left in the cold water for good. Halfway around the world, in the jungle airfields of New Guinea, Japanese ground crews gave this same aircraft a name of its own. They called it Whispering Death. Remember those quiet engines? The sleeve valves that took away the mechanical clatter of a normal fighter? In the thick tropical air, that meant a strike could arrive on top of a parked squadron before anyone on the ground even looked up. No engine roar building in the distance. No warning siren with time to matter. Just cannon fire, out of a clear sky, and then silence again. The purest version of this tactic came in the Pacific, in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, early March 1943. Allied intelligence spotted a convoy. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers, all steaming toward reinforcements desperately needed in New Guinea. 13 aircraft of 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, went in first, skimming the water at 225 knots, so low that spray from the wavetops streaked their windscreens. Naval doctrine said turn your bow toward an incoming torpedo bomber to shrink your target profile and let the torpedo pass wide. These aircraft weren't carrying torpedoes. Every Japanese captain who turned to face them instead opened up the full length of his deck, bridge, gun crews, everything, to 52 cannons and 78 machine guns, all firing at once. The convoy's anti-aircraft defense collapsed in seconds, clearing the sky for American B-25s to finish the job with skip bombing. 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk. Close to 3,000 Japanese soldiers killed. General MacArthur called it the most decisive air battle fought in the entire Southwest Pacific. For all of that, this was still an 11.5-ton aircraft. It was never quick, and on February 9, 1945, that single fact was paid for in blood. The target was the German destroyer Z-33, hiding deep inside Førdefjord, Norway. A fjord shaped like a stone corridor, walls of rock and snow rising straight out of the water on either side. More than 30 of these aircraft couldn't spread out to attack. The terrain wouldn't allow it. They had to fly in single file, one after another, straight down a corridor of flak with nowhere to turn and nowhere to climb. Then 12 Focke-Wulf 190s dropped out of the clouds above them. In that narrow space, a heavy fighter has no room to dodge, no room to run, nowhere left to be anything but a target. 9 aircraft were lost that day. 14 aircrew never came home. 4 more spent the rest of the war as prisoners. It remains the single worst day, in the single worst mission, in the history of the coastal strike wings. There's one final irony in this aircraft's entire career. The Air Ministry never wanted it as anything more than a stopgap, a placeholder, while its real fighter, the sleek and much-hyped Westland Whirlwind, got finished, and everyone quietly moved on. The Whirlwind was elegant, fast, on paper. It was also underpowered, dangerous to land, plagued by engines nobody wanted to keep building, and dead after barely 114 were made. The stopgap, the barn door, the recoiling brute, the aircraft nobody wanted to be caught flying, went on to nearly 6,000 built, in Britain and Australia combined. It hauled targets for gunnery practice. It bombed insurgents in Malaya. It flew, quietly, for the fledgling Israeli Air Force. It saw combat as far away as the Dominican Republic. It didn't retire until 1960, 20 years after its first flight, and long after almost everyone had forgotten it was ever meant to be temporary. And here's the part almost nobody expects. After the war, Britain scrapped most of its own aircraft from this program without a second thought. No preservation effort, no ceremony, just the cutting torch. One airframe after another fed into the scrapyard. So why do complete, original examples still exist in the world's top aviation museums today? Not because of the RAF. Because of a schoolteacher in Portugal. In 1949, when the Portuguese Navy retired its Beaufighters, a teacher at the Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon bought 2 of them for scrap value, to use as teaching aids for his engineering students. His school pressured him, repeatedly, to cut them up for storage space.
He refused.
Every time. And because one stubborn man refused to let go of 2 obsolete airframes sitting in a schoolyard, both survived long enough for the British to eventually admit their mistake and bring them home for restoration, decades later. The Bristol Beaufighter was never elegant. It recoiled when it fired. It could kill its own pilot with 1 dead engine and a torque roll he had 2 seconds to catch. Its only way out, when everything went wrong, was a hole in the floor and a set of steel bars you had to be strong enough and lucky enough to reach. But in the darkest years of that war, the Allies didn't need a ballet dancer. They didn't need something graceful to photograph for the newsreels. They needed someone who could swing a sledgehammer, and swing it harder than anything else in the sky. Night after night, convoy after convoy, fjord after fjord. Thanks for flying through this one with me. Tell me where you land. Pure firepower over grace, or grace over firepower. Drop it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next file.